Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
What's the saddest story you've ever heard? My mom was threatening divorce, and my dad was very, very depressed over it. For about a week I went back and forth from the place my mom was staying and my home, where my dad was. I tried to make him feel better, and he kept asking me about my mom, asking me to talk to her, do anything I could to change her mind. I couldn't bring myself to tell him my mom had already made her decision. The night before Father's Day I was leaving to spend the night with some friends. Before I left, I told him I'll be back early so I could make breakfast for him for Father's Day. He said he'll take a rain check. I didn't think anything of it. I went to a club that night, and took some ecstasy. I was at the time also prescribed Adderall and was discreetly taking more than recommended. After an hour of feeling nothing I began to feel lightheaded and hot. My heart started racing and I could barely think. I begged my friends to take me to the hospital that something was happening to me. They shrugged it off. Finally a boy I met that day who was friends with one of my friends drove me back to his house. The whole ride home I was struggling to regulate my breath and heart rate, fearing for my life. When we got to his house my body began to calm down, leaving me extremely weak and exhausted. I remember lying on his bed, still terrified of what and still could happen. His dog came up to me, jumped on the couch and curled up next to me, making it so his head propped on my leg, a melancholy look on his face. At about 6 a.m., all my friends were home, and after they begged forgiveness for not caring for me like they should have, I asked to be driven home. On the way I randomly started tearing up, thinking I'll have to ask my dad to take me to the hospital, something doesn't feel right. When we got to the house I went to the door to see a note taped onto it. It basically said, "Don't go in the house and call the police. I'm sorry for being such a coward." My already weakened heart dropped. In shock, I called the police, eyes completely dry, that my dad had killed himself. I sat on the porch and cried. There was a lot of crying that day. My mom wailed when she drove up to the house, crying, "Oh my God, oh my God." I was taken to our neighbor's house and put to bed in the guest room. The rest of the day was spent alone, willing my body to survive. There were moments where I felt like it was going to shut down. I was too weak to cry. After a while I realized it was Father's Day.
G is from India but works here in the US. He was very close to his grandfather who died suddenly one day due to age-related health issues. He flew back to India immediately. After about 10 to 13 days, my boyfriend gets an email from him with just a subject line ", "I came here for 1 but attended 3. My BF was really confused and knew something was wrong. He didn't have his contact number so he asked around a bit and finally got in touch. He called up G and found out that his brother and uncle drowned 3 days back. They'd gone up to a nearby river to perform some last rites for the grandfather and ended up drowning. He came there for 1 funeral and ended up attending 2 more. G's dad lost his father, son and brother. Saddest thing I have heard till now, sad face.
My girlfriend's granddad passed away a couple of months ago. Her grandma is old and has been slowly losing her short-term memory. Needless to say, she was extremely torn up about losing her husband of 60 years. To make matters worse, every morning when she wakes up, she forgets he's dead. She makes him breakfast and takes it into the study. Doesn't find him there, so walks into every room in the house looking for him. Calls up one of her kids to ask where he is. They tell her what happened, and she spends the rest of her day crying like he just died that day. Archived post. New comments cannot be posted and votes cannot be cast.
I was really close to my dad till he passed away when I was 7. By that time, my mom had divorced him and we lived across town. I went to school one day and talked to my old neighbor who told me that my dad had died. I had no idea because my mom or nobody in my family cared to tell me. In all honesty, I still haven't forgiven my mom for not telling me. She wouldn't even tell me where he was buried. I finally found it after years of searching all the graveyards in my hometown. I was with my then BF, and we were visiting his mom's grave when I saw my last name on a gravestone. Turns out it was my dad. I visit his grave as often as I can. I still think about him every day.
When I was living in a third world country years ago, there was this guy about my age, I was 19 at the time, who was blind, and sometimes wandered the streets of my neighborhood selling brooms, which he carried in a bundle in his back. He didn't have a dog or anything, just a staff. I saw him walk by the house where we lived a few times and I felt kind of sorry for him, but the first few times didn't really think much of it. What struck me about him, I suppose, was that he was my age. Normally poor people on the streets are very old or very young, or maybe women with children. Here was a dude that looked otherwise healthy yet was obviously quite destitute but tried to make a living despite his disability, and believe me, it's quite different to live with a disability in a country like that than it is in France or the US. A few months after I had last seen him, I came home and my mom was having a reunion with some of her lady expat friends as she did once a week. Tea and so on. I stopped by the solarium where they were, said hello to all and proceeded to grab me a soda and a few pastries. While I was doing this, I picked up on the conversation they were having. It turns out that the day before there had been a murder in a poor neighborhood that bordered ours. Not an unusual occurrence, but what stopped me was one of the ladies saying that they had killed a blind couple. I inquired further and it turns out that it was this guy. The ladies knew him, of course, because they lived in the same area and I suppose even bought a broom or two from him at some point. Then it got worse. He lived in a little house with his wife, who was also blind. Apparently she worked doing needlepoint or something like that. Men, number unknown, had broken into their house at night, assaulted the guy, I mean how he could defend himself, and while he was lying on the floor bleeding. Then they stabbed her, and kicked the guy's head in against the concrete floor of the house as they were leaving, killing him. She was still alive when they found her the next morning, but she died later. These were two disabled kids who had rallied against poverty and discrimination and tried to make it in the world on their own. They didn't deserve it. I think this has stuck with me over the years as something very sad because I always remembered seeing the guy walking slowly with his staff clicking on the pavement, yelling out brooms, brooms, and I wanted to come over and talk to him, ask him what his name was, if he had been born that way, and maybe help. Hell, maybe even buy a broom I didn't need. But I never did it. I could never shake the feeling that maybe I could have done something for him, and his wife, if I had known she existed, that maybe I could have prevented that from happening to them. His name was Enrico, and his wife's name was Zola. I never saw or met Zola.
My mom told me the story when I was 16 or so. When she was in a master's program at UW in Madison, her best friend was another master's kid. They were both about 21, both graduated early from high school, who was from Zimbabwe. His name was Darlington. They spent all their time hanging out doing crazy stuff like lighting a chemistry lab on fire and then laughing too hard to put it out, etc. They were super in love. However, this was the Midwest, albeit a liberal city, in the early 70s. The white and black students did not particularly mix, and they did not date. Darlington, being a pretty African boy with a cool accent, was constantly propositioned in a condescending way by white chicks wanting some sort of a carnival ride. My mom, a super blonde blue-eyed Swedish lady, after being seen with him, was harassed and threatened by black girls who assumed she was using him this way as well as constantly propositioned by guys who thought that her being with him meant she had no standards. It was kind of the opposite. Basically, everyone gave them hell, all the time, constantly. I can't really describe the severity of it. She got upset talking about it and didn't go into too many details. It definitely included violence and social exclusion in a big way. Darlington was threatened and attacked, and my mom was threatened. It was bad. One day my mom went to find him and he was gone. He had left her a letter explaining that he didn't want to leave her, but he couldn't stand the constant abuse towards both of them and that hopefully she could be happier without him there. He had gone back to Zimbabwe, which shortly thereafter collapsed into the state we know it as now. She was unable to ever get in contact with him. I cried big time when she told me that story, and not just because my then current boyfriend's strictly Hindu parents wouldn't let him see me.
A friend of my brother's used to live in Juarez, Mexico. I'm sure you've heard about the violence. We hadn't heard from him in a long while when out of nowhere my brother got a phone call from him. He was living in another state far from the border. The reason? Someone kidnapped his little sister. They couldn't find her for months. Eventually her body was found. The police predictably had no leads as to who her murderer was. Their mother began protesting near a city government building and was eventually gunned down in front of a government building. Again, no leads. Then his life was threatened as well and he fled far away from the border. Poor guy lost his sister and his mom in less than a year. When I was a kid I had 3 dogs, 2 males, King and Frank, and a female, May. Anyways, King always acted dominantly, and for years he would regularly beat up Frank to prove his superiority. One day Frank had enough of it and attacked King. His entire chest was torn up. He barely survived surgery. Within a week his kidneys had failed and he died. My dad nearly put Frank down, but instead he gave him away and I never saw him again. I helped bury King, and while he was lying in a blanket as we dug, May came and sat by his body. 2 weeks later I woke to find her dead in her dog house. She had no visible signs of injury and had been healthy. She was buried by morning. It might not compare to other people's stories, they're only dogs anyways, but it was really hard losing all 3 of my childhood dogs, friends I'd known my entire life, within a few weeks. I haven't cried ever since I buried May. This is in a third world country. When I was a small boy I used to see poor street kids outside. They wore rags, were often hungry, dirty, they were paupers, illiterate and uneducated. I'm not sure whether they had parents. Most didn't. Some would have their limbs broken by unscrupulous people, so they could elicit more sympathy as they begged for money. A truly heart-wrenching sight. They would often sift through the rubbish for their food. It was very sad seeing this, even when I was a young boy, seeing that they weren't that different from me. But there was this one poor girl. Her parents must have died or something, for I would often see her going from house to house begging for food. Sometimes people would throw scraps of food out for the dogs and I would often see her eating those scraps with them. Like the others, her clothing barely sufficed to hide her nakedness. It would do for the summer, but in the winter, she would struggle. And so winter came. I recall me starting school, and me feeling sorry for her that she didn't go. It was an especially cold night, one where it snowed. The temperature must have been below 0 for sure. I recall her knocking on the door, banging, pleading for someone to let her in. My mother answered the door and scolded her, telling her to go away. These street kids were treated worse than those slum dogs. The door was slammed. She was still outside, knocking, pleading for some respite from the bitter wind. But to no avail. The night passed as normal. I dressed to go to school the next day. It snowed all night. Everything was white outside, glistening in the sun. Outside, I saw a strange lump of snow, just near the doorstep. It was as if somebody left some rocks there overnight. I uncovered the snow, curious to see what underneath, when then all of a sudden I recoiled back in horror. It was the poor child, frozen solid in the snow. She died outside our very doorstep, in the cold. I was shocked. And my heart welled up with guilt and pity for her. Why didn't my poor old mother let her in? Why didn't I let her in? Surely if I asked my mother she would have taken care of that poor orphan child. I hope she's gone off to a much better place. Away from cruel and unsympathetic people like me. She has been etched in my memory ever since. A truly heartbreaking moment. The guilt never ever goes away. She was my age. Perhaps 4 or 5. RIP. Same thing is going on with both of my grandmothers. Grandpa died a few years ago. Sometimes she used to call and ask if we knew where he was since she has a feeling she hasn't seen him in a while. We'd then inform her that he passed away. Each time it hurt just as much to inform her. Seeing old people cry is so heartbreaking. She's in a senior's residence now because her memory has gotten much worse. She does not ask us anymore about where he is. For Christmas we had dinner with her. She does not remember that I am her granddaughter. Sad face. I remember seeing her stare quietly at her plate with this frown as everyone around her talked and laughed, and I couldn't help but stare at her, hoping she would go back to remembering who I was eventually. She continued to look down at her plate with a small frown, and that's when I had to get up from the table to find a room to cry in. My other grandmother, who lives in Russia, used to always talk to my mom on the phone and would insist on talking to me and would go on and on and on about how she misses me and would say something like, "And I send you one big kiss on your nose, one big kiss on your forehead, one big kiss on your left hand, one big kiss on your right hand, one big kiss on each toe." And as an impatient 10-year-old I remember rolling my eyes and hoping she would hurry up with the goodbyes. She now also has no memory of me either. Last time I went to Russia to visit my family, I was hugging everyone and had tears of joy streaming down my face. Then I saw my grandmother. No reaction to my return. She was there and I couldn't hug her. Not even a hello. How I wish I could hear her over the phone again. My grandfather loves her so much he dresses her daily and takes her on walks, cooks for her, constant 24/7 care for her, just as though she is a little child. Now I'm getting all teary-eyed from thinking about it. I work with a mentor program at a local elementary school. The first time we walked into the classroom there was a boy sitting by himself in the corner of the room. I go and sit with him for the rest of the lesson, thinking he may have just been unpopular. At the end of the class the teacher pulls me to the side and tells me that the kid has not had a shower in over a month. The smell was the reason none of the kids wanted to sit next to him. To add on top of that, she tells me the kid hasn't had power in his house in over 2 months. I'm feeling really sorry for the kid now, but there's not much I can do. The next week we come back to the same class to some more bad news. Between last week and now the kid's house had burned down to the ground. Now he was staying in a shelter with his mother and her lesbian lover, who supposedly beats her in front of him. This kid is in the 5th grade and almost cannot read at all. If that wasn't enough, this kid gets teased at school, and as a result he gets into a lot of fights and arguments. The school is actually trying to get him expelled. I have been doing everything I can to help this kid, but shit like this breaks my heart. Friend of mine was married, not super happy, but trying to make it work. They went out drinking one night and she had way too much. He was grinding with random girls on the dance floor and refused to leave with her. She takes off bawling and a friend of a friend from the group follows her home. Her recollection is spotty because she was blacking out from the alcohol. She knows that the guy hate her. She knows she said no several times, but because she does not remember much it's hard to know exactly what happened. When she told her husband, who did not go home that night, he divorced her. Tore the families apart. Screwed her out of their assets. She later found out from a friend who was with them that night that the rapist had joked with her husband about swapping their women, and that her husband watched the rapist chase after her when she left the bar. I cried a lot with her after that. People are scum. I remember when I was a wee lad, way younger than my current old age of early 20s. I would visit my great-grandmother in aged care and she would ask where my great-grandfather was. I would always go to say he passed away because Mum explained it to me, but I never really understood any of the reason why she hushed me up quickly. I never found out about the whole great-grandmother story until recently when I was better able to understand. Every day we went to visit her she was told her husband was just up the road to get some milk and the paper. She was in a nursing home and he had passed away long ago. It never really sunk in. I guess dementia can be cruel or kind. I had a teacher recently tell me his old man has bad dementia and believes the animals, horses, goats he has never had in his life have recently passed away and aren't in his regular suburban backyard anymore. This teacher told me straight up he would rather see his father die than has him in this half-decayed state. Those two are pretty sad. Oh, I remember a lady who would always send me candy bars for birthdays even though I wouldn't see her some years, too young to make that decision or travel myself, and give me some presents. Very sweet lady. I remember getting a wallet one year and finding a $5 note and coins in it. Who does that? So thoughtful to add an extra little surprise. Anyway, not to get too off track, this lady never really had her own life. Her brother had a mental disability and needed constant care. She gave up her own life to stay in the family home and look after him when the parents passed away. No dating, no crazy relationships or flings, just dedication to looking after her brother. That selflessness always struck a chord with me. I remember hearing that she had a heart attack one day and passed away. With all due respects, that's all the sad stories I want to remember for now. I think I'm going to move on from this thread. When I was about 4, my mother was diagnosed with brain cancer. She fought it for about 3 years before her doctor finally told her she was terminal, and had a month left to live. That night, she put together a bucket list of things she wanted to do before passed: visit the town where she grew up and her family, eat at her favorite restaurant one last time, take me to the stable where she rode horses when she was my age, etc. She finished the list in about 2 weeks. The night after she finished the last thing, she went into a coma, and she died the next day. I was working in a jewelry store about 5 years ago, when a woman came in with one of our bags, and asked about our return policy while obviously trying to fight back tears. I could tell something was wrong, so I told her that it's normally 30 days, but we have made exceptions for extenuating circumstances, which we had. She lost her composure for about 2 seconds before pulling herself together and explaining to me that she and her fiancé had bought wedding bands from us about 3 months ago, about a month before their wedding. At this point, I'm expecting a broken engagement or an annulment, but what she told me was so much worse. About a month after the wedding, her husband was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and 2 weeks later, he died. She needed to return the rings to pay for his final expenses. That is, hands down, the saddest thing I heard in the 7 years I worked in jewelry. In middle school, I had a friend named Brooke. She was the coolest, most honest girl I've ever had the honor of meeting. I always admired her, and wondered at her strength of character. She had no problem telling anyone to go fund themselves. Freshman year of high school, I was at her house and overheard a conversation with her mom. She had a brain tumor, and it was inoperable. When I expressed my concern for her, she insisted that it didn't really matter because the tumor was benign. Just causes some bitchin' headaches, she'd said with a laugh. I believed her. High school went as it goes, and we gradually drifted apart. Her mom married, so they moved in with her stepfather, who I heard adopted her. Her dad walked when she was little. I eventually lost her number. One day, I was on MySpace and saw her name, so I decided to send her a message. I sent several messages to her over the next month or so, but none were answered. About a week after I gave up, another old friend from middle school messaged me, and I asked about Brooke. She told me Brooke had died. She lied. The tumor was malignant. Brooke was barely 18. She didn't even graduate high school, which was her one big goal in life, to be the first in her family to get a diploma. I look back on the years I knew her, and I remember a time when she was my only friend, the only one willing to stick up for me. Every day, I try to be just a bit more like her. A bit more honest. A bit more open. A bit more caring. And I know we hadn't talked in a while, but I wish I'd been able to tell her how much she meant to me, how amazing a person she was, and how she'd saved my life. I wish I'd told her goodbye. My great-grandmother, by marriage, was severely senile. She needed help with almost everything. One day, her husband was helping her to the bathroom, when he fell, breaking his femur in 3 places. She didn't notice. I think he was on the floor for a few hours, I'm not sure. But, seeing your loved one seemingly not care that you're in dire need of medical attention is one of the most heartbreaking things I can think of. I couldn't imagine being within a stone's throw away from someone I've known and loved for over 70 years, and being completely helpless. He passed away within a week of being diagnosed with extremely advanced stages of stomach cancer. She would be told that he had passed on, and it would be a matter of minutes before she forgot. I don't want to know how many times this process repeated. She passed away the 17th of last month. I didn't have a lot of friends I trusted when growing up, a lot of the local kids were dicks. My dad had some ham radio friends down in the States, so we would travel down every 3 to 4 years. There was one family of 2 sons, mother and father, who we visited every time in Oregon. I was 15 this time, and I struck an incredible friendship in the few weeks we were there with the younger son, who was the same age. Dude stuck up for me and hung out every waking hour. He was the epitome of cool. The night before we left the campsite I woke up crying. I had a dream he had died. I shook that off, thinking it was odd because I rarely cried about anything, never told him because I was too embarrassed. We planned to meet up when we got our licenses and spend the next summer together. My family left. 2 weeks later he was struck by a drunk driver while riding his bike to school and cracked his skull so bad he wasn't going to come back. I cried for about a day. My father figured I hardly knew him enough to warrant this. While in the hospital, a week later, his parents discussed pulling the plug on their vegetable son. His father felt horrible. He got checked out. Pancreatic cancer. He died 2 weeks later. Within 1 month my friend's mother had lost her youngest son and her husband. We lost touch with them, but I know the older son was in the army, not sure how that story ended. My friend had a very good friend, John, who moved to LA from Toronto. He met another guy one day at work, Kyle. They started hanging out quite a bit, and since John had only recently moved to LA, Kyle quickly became his best friend. They started dating about 1 month later were completely in love. They were inseparable and after a while were convinced they would be together for the long term. A few months later, Kyle died in his sleep and John woke up to find him dead, still wrapped in his arms. It gets worse. Turns out that Kyle had never come out to his parents, and as such, they knew next to nothing about John. At the funeral, even though John was the closest person to Kyle, he could not speak with anyone at the ceremony. He couldn't bring himself to out Kyle to his parents, who were grieving just as much as John. John lost the love of his life and never got the closure he needed when he lost him. It's really sad if you know John. I met him once, and just knowing what he went through made me want to cry. When I was in high school, I had a friend named Stan. Stan was probably one of the nicest, most incredibly genuine people I have ever met in my entire life. He was incredibly tall, and loved to play Spider-Man by putting his feet on one wall and his hands on the other and holding himself on the ceiling. Despite his age, he loved SpongeBob, and would come to school dressed in SpongeBob gear head to toe. Towards the end of his senior year Stan had started to feel sick. A week after he graduated, he found out he had liver cancer. I saw him a couple months later. Already incredibly thin, he was nothing more than skin and bones and he looked more tired than I thought someone could be. By January he was dead. 18 years old, his whole life ahead of him, and he was gone. The only good thing I can say about this whole thing was the show of support at his wake. It was held in the gymnasium of his church. Every single seat was filled. I'm talking hundreds of people. I was in my school's choir, and our conductor offered to have us perform. My mom made SpongeBob scarves for all of us to wear in honor of Stan. Trying to perform for hundreds of people while my friend was lying dead in a casket in front of me was one of the hardest things I've ever had to. It's been 4 years and I still miss him. My SpongeBob scarf still hangs on the back of my bedroom door. In December, I met a quiet girl my age that was dating a close friend of mine. We all have 2-year-old sons, so we decided to take them to the park and let them play. I only hung out with the girl a few times, but her son and mine seemed to like each other. About a week after that, my friend who was seeing her decided to text her and sees what she was up to. Only to have her mother respond that there had been a terrible accident. Apparently, while waiting to turn at a light on a road notorious for dangerous accidents, her car was plowed from behind by a speeding dump truck, who didn't see her car, and also his brakes mysteriously failed at the moment. He pushed her car into oncoming traffic where she was blindsided by a pickup truck. They flew her to the university hospital, but her son, who was strapped in his car seat in the back, was killed. His car seat had been pushed through the dash of the car, killing him instantly. She was a single mom and her son was the only thing in the world she cared about. Every time she woke from her sedated state she begged to know what happened to him. They were afraid to tell her that he didn't make it, so for 2 weeks while they did surgeries and kept her from dying, they sedated her every time she asked for him. By the time she found out, it was the day or so before Christmas. I know that bad things happen every day, but as a mother, the loss of a child compares to nothing else. I hope and pray that no one has to lose a child, no matter how old. My grandma has had kidney problems for a really long time. She'd been on dialysis and all that, and the only solution was that she needed a transplant. She had a blood transfusion which had given her a bit of strength back, and so she and my grandpa decided they'd go visit Utah because they'd always wanted to go. I spoke to her on the phone a week before their trip, and she told me that on their trip my grandpa would be going hiking and she would sit in coffee shops catching up on her reading. She was extremely excited. They caught their flight over to Utah. However, once they got there they were met by airport staff who had been called to find my grandparents and tell them they needed to return home immediately because they had found my grandma a kidney for her transplant, and so they got straight back onto the plane and flew home. The transplant was done almost as soon as they returned. It went well and my grandma was in good spirits. They let her go home. My grandpa awoke in the middle of the night to my grandma, who I guess was choking or something. I don't know for sure because I only heard this off my dad. She was dying though. She stayed conscious for a little while before she no longer knew where she was, and she died with my grandpa beside her. Turns out her kidney had rejected. I guess they probably released her too early from the hospital. I don't really know the whole story there. She never got to see Utah. I don't know why, but the fact that they got so close only to then be told that she would get this kidney and to have all that excitement and happiness when it seemed like it was a success. It just breaks my heart. This is more a story I watched, part of the Planet Earth series. So there is this polar bear and he is swimming from one glacier to the next to find food. Because the snow is melting so fast, he swims and he swims for hours, maybe days. The point is he is very tired and hungry, and alone. So he finally finds a piece of ice covered in walruses. I hope to God that's right. He knows that it's big risk to try and hunt one of these creatures, but he is starving and tired. So he attacks one of them and they fight. The polar bear gets very injured. After the fight the polar bear digs a hole in the ice and kind of curls up into a ball and dies. I remember that I couldn't stop crying after watching it, and when I woke up the next morning I cried some more. Even today it breaks my heart. I was working at a front desk for a hotel and this young couple comes in. They just got married. They literally are in such a fantastic mood that they float around the lobby in a daze. The love that is held between their eyes literally lights up the entire lobby full of other guests. As they leave, in come a couple younger kids. A couple teenagers and some smaller ones. They're devastated. Apparently, they were staying at the hotel so they could say goodbye to their grandpa who was passing onward. There is a hospital next door. They were expecting one of those Hollywood send-offs where everyone smiles and says goodbye while he passes on. Didn't quite happen that way. Their parents called and the message didn't come through completely, so they raced to the hospital when they should have gone to the hotel. They walked in on their grandpa being wrapped up and being taken to the morgue. They literally flipped out and ran out of the building. When they arrived at the hotel, the parents in the lobby felt horrible. The uncle turns to me and says, "Well, shit." Takes a sip of beer and secretly slips $50s into each kid's pockets. Took him a while. It really sucked. 1 minute. You literally see immortality. It's taken away. I and a friend were visiting another friend in Malaysia. On our last day there we found ourselves with way more hash than we could possibly smuggle back home. We had bought a load of it, 'cause the stuff is so damn cheap there. It was such a joke. During the 3 days we owned this brick of hash, I laughed every time I looked at the absurd amount we were able to buy. In the end we decided just to dump it in a trash can. My friend and I returned home and heard no more from our friend overseas until 2 years later. One day a woman claiming to be a lawyer knocked on my door asking for me. She informs me that my friend in Malaysia has spent the last 2 years locked up in prison. Apparently someone found the brick of hash we had thrown out and ratted out my friend. The worst part, this lawyer tells me, is that unless I and my other friend come back to Malaysia to share responsibility for the hash, that my friend in Malaysia will be executed. So my friend and I get ourselves back to Malaysia to see what we can do to help our friend. We get there and find out that if we split the responsibility for the hash 3 ways we will each receive 5 years in prison, if only 2 of us take responsibility it will be 8 years each, and if our friend has to take all the responsibility he will be hanged. I and this friend get a chance to go visit our friend in prison and check out the conditions there. The place is about as hospitable as you would expect a Malaysian prison to be. And our friend on the inside isn't looking so hot. They tell us he hasn't been tortured or starved, but I couldn't tell by looking at him, that's for sure. My other friend is starting to get cold feet at this point. After our little visit my friend's lawyer decides to drop a bombshell on us. Turns out she is my friend's sister. The fact that she's kept this from us doesn't sit well at all with my other friend and he decides to bail. Now I'm sitting in Malaysia having to decide whether or not I'm going to spend the next 8 years in a dark, dirty Malaysian prison or if I'm going to let a friend hang. I'm proud to say that in the end I decided to man up and face the Malaysian justice system. I would still be in that hellhole today if it weren't for what happened next. At the Malaysian court, despite being lauded for my courage to take responsibility, the judge became enraged upon learning that the American media was condemning the harsh sentences being imposed on us. Before I could even understand what was happening, I was being hauled off to prison and my friend was sentenced to die. The next day, from a tiny window in my tiny cell, I watched my friend get executed in the prison courtyard. I looked him straight in the eye just before it happened and all I could see was complete and utter terror. The Malaysian government had me released 6 months later and not a day goes by that I don't think back to how scared my friend was the second before he died. When I was about 9 or so, I went to school near my great-grandma, Mimi's retirement home. After school one day I decided I wanted to go pay her a visit. I went to the store, bought some candy, then went out to the retirement home, and went up to her room, knocked, went in. We joked around a little since I was chewing bubble tape gum, and she thought it was funny how people looked like a cow chewing its cud when they chewed gum. Anyway, she never was really good with computers. The main problem was that she didn't know how to turn it on, so she had me turn her computer on, and open up her email. Her son had sent an email to her, and she asked me to read it to her. It turns out his wife had just died of cancer, I believe. I was too young to even think to try to console her. So I just sat there, and watched her cry, then eventually said goodbye and left. I still wish I could go back and at least give her a hug. She had a good, long life though. She died about 4 years ago at the age of 98 years, and 18 days. I'll always miss her. Guy was 19, and had a car in the 1970s, which doesn't scream responsibility to begin with. Well, his parents left him his 18-month-old baby brother to babysit while they went across the state or something for the night. Guy, instead of taking care of the kid, threw him in the car and went to a party. Left the kid in the car for hours. Came back out plastered with his best friend, and they hopped in the front seat and took off, driving drunk. Parked by the highway was a flatbed truck with a load of steel pipe on it. No lights on or anything, and sure enough, Guy rear-ends the truck. Impact kills his best friend instantly, and a pipe goes through the seat, barely missing the guy driving, and impales the 18-month-old kid through the head, killing him. The guy driving somehow walked away with only a broken arm and a few cuts and bruises. Upon hearing the news, his mother was frantic and died of a heart attack. The boy who caused it all was so torn up by it after the fact he shot himself. So in the end, all that was left was the father, and he apparently stopped showing up to his job and drank himself to death after about 10 years. When I first heard all this, I thought it was a little too crazy and sad to be true, but apparently there was a huge deal about it when it happened, and there are still memorials where the car crashed and at the high school. I work for a newspaper in a Californian city on the ocean, and a few years ago I photographed a story about the first group in the country for male survivors of assault or men that were molested as kids by priests or teachers or whoever. One of the guys grew up in a town maybe 20 miles from the ocean. He was 35 when I photographed him, and in his entire life, growing up and living only less than 20 miles from the ocean, he had once never seen the ocean. Like ever. And it was heartbreaking hearing this from someone who drives to work every day on a highway that overlooks the ocean for a bit. That story still haunts me. One of my best friend's mothers had died unexpectedly, supposedly from a drug overdose. I couldn't bring myself to ask the details. I had never seen my friend Dan cries before. He's always the cheeriest one of the group, and never misses the opportunity to make a joke. His parents had been divorced for quite some time, and his dad was always on the road. He wouldn't see his dad more than twice any given year. After his mom passed, his dad moves back, gets himself a place, and resumes his role as dad. It was bittersweet. A little over 4 years later, suddenly the father has a heart attack and also dies. Dan is about 20 years old at this time, and his sister is 18. It was devastating for them both, to say the least. The week after their dad's funeral, Dan's sister has a miscarriage with her baby. The doctors said that it could likely have been due to the stress caused by their father's death. Most of the life insurance policy went to Dan's sister for the medical visits she needed. As for Dan, since his father was no longer around to help pay for his tuition, he's been forced to drop out for the time being until he can qualify for a grant. During the Holocaust, after a group of Jews were gassed, it was typically other Jews that were forced to go into the chamber, raid the bodies for gold fillings, and load them into ovens to be burned. One thing that most people don't know is that the gas chambers weren't 100% effective. Sometimes people would still be hanging on, wheezing and shit. So anyway, my prof said he once had a conversation with a Holocaust survivor whose entire family had been gassed. Years later he was on the streets of New York when another stranger came up to him with a confession. The stranger said that he recognized him, and that he was one of the Jews who went into the chamber after his parents were gassed. He confessed that he had been the one to put his parents into the gas chamber and said that at the time they were still alive. My sister had been sick for a while, and she was in the hospital for 5 months starting at the end of 2006. One day my brother and I were supposed to be going to visit her. Well, we kind of overslept and my dad came and yelled at me to get up and get going. So on the way to the hospital with my brother I get a call from one of my sister's nurses saying that they had her stable. Last thing I knew she was stable. I figured from that point things were not good. When we finally arrive at the hospital my mom is outside and she looks like hell. She tells us that the doctors said our sister isn't going to make it through the day. The walk down the hallway to her room in the hospital seemed like it happened in slow motion, like I didn't want to make it there because I knew what was going to happen. I was standing in her room watching the screen with her vitals on it, and her heartbeat was going down by one beat every few seconds. My dad told us to say our goodbyes. My mom, dad, brother and me were standing by her side and my dad said to her, "Kunzeit, it's okay if you want to rest, we're all here," and it was a matter of seconds and she was gone. That was May 13, 2007, Mother's Day, she was 9. This is a story of my neighbor overseas. Mary had a 19-year-old son in the 80s. He was quiet and shy. He joined a political group that was active but peaceful. In a political conflict, he was arrested/kidnapped. We later found out that he was imprisoned. But no one really knew where he was imprisoned and what his situation was. A couple of years after his disappearance we found out he was executed. His mom to this day bakes a cake every year on his birthday, makes his favorite food at least once a week, writes him letters, maintains his room. She keeps telling anyone who would listen that he will be showing up any minute. She never travels or goes far from the house in fear that one day he'll show up and she won't be home to meet him. It was the evening I was in labor with my daughter. Everything was going smoothly and my labor was perfect. I had friends at the hospital celebrating, my family was in good spirits and aside from the contractions, and I was doing great. But then in the halls came devastating cries from multiple people. They barely sounded human, they were so intensely loud and carrying into our birthing room. A feeling of immediate dread hit me and then my sister and mom came in with the sad news. Apparently there had been another woman going into labor at the same time as me. She was only 6 months pregnant and had to give birth to her child, who happened to be a stillborn. The cries were, "Not again. Not again. I can't go through this again," which we would later discover was because this woman had gone through this process multiple times, never able to take her baby home. I went through the rest of my labor feeling flawlessly and gave birth to a very healthy girl, but my heart felt so sad for that woman grieving in the other room. No one should have to leave the birthing center without a baby. Jack was a really nice guy, but weak and easily led. His mom was dead and his dad, also a wonderful person, raised him alone. Jack was everything to his father. When Jack was 18 his childhood sweetheart went off to college and he took this as a rejection. He got a slut pregnant and married her, this was her 4th kid, all with different fathers. They fought all the time as she cheated on him and he wasn't able to cope well with these neglected kids. On Father's Day he sat out in the sun and drank and watched the kids in the kiddie pool and shot himself. The cops told his father that Jack was so drunk and so dehydrated he probably didn't know what he was doing. I've never seen anything sadder than his father's eyes during the months he tried to get custody of his grandson, the only family he had left. 32. My family had known the Damons since the early 90s, my brother and I knowing their sons from church and playgroup, and my dad knowing their dad and grandfather from working together at the university. The grandparents, Jinx and Paul, had that perfect sweet love that makes people long for anything close to it, getting married at 18 just after World War II. Paul was forced to retire in 2004, but was left with his office, as is custom, to continue to work as assist as he saw fit. In 2008, Paul didn't come home to Jinx, and she started to worry, as he was normally a punctual man who would call ahead to alert people of his tardiness. She called my dad, who hadn't seen him all day, different buildings. They wrote it off until later that night, when the janitorial staff came in at night and went into his office. It turns out that Paul had suffered a massive stroke in his office early morning with his door closed, and no one found out until the janitors opened the door. He was sprawled out in between file cabinets, awake, waiting for anyone to come in. He was rushed to the nearby hospital, and Jinx raced over to see her husband. Paul died only a few hours later holding Jinx's hand, unable to say a word or do a thing. He suffered a killing blow in the early hours of the day, and clung to what was left of himself for what must have been an eternity for him. I don't know if he thought he would survive, but I do know that he held on for her, so that he would be with her one more time. I saw Jinx the next day when I was helping unload his office of personal effects that we needed to make sure didn't go to auction or surplus. She wasn't at his office, but at her home she was only a shell of a woman, half the time not aware that we were there, crying in her half of their love seats. The rest of the time she was thanking us all for helping, that having people who knew him around made it better for her. Fast forward a couple months and her daughter convinced her to move into assisted living. Again I helped move her in, and seeing her then she looked like the old Jinx, happy and joking with everyone she met. She was so happy for someone who I had never seen apart from her husband. She stayed there for a few months before she suffered her own stroke in her home, but due to the nature of her living she was rescued before too much damage was done, but it was too much. Her daughter took her home with her for her last few weeks, but Jinx was done. She died in her sleep less than a month later, before a year had passed since Paul's death. They remind me of Bacchus and Philemon from Greek myth, an elderly couple who are the only people in an entire town that show hospitality to two wandering strangers, read, Zeus and Hermes. After killing the rest of the town because the old couple mentions not really liking them, the gods offer the couple a wish. They ask that when one of them dies, that the other would soon follow, which eventually happens a year apart. For showing such humility and love, Zeus agrees, and goes on to turn them into an oak and linden tree when they die, side by side, branches interwoven. I like to think of Jinx and Paul like that. Some of my soldiers were in a parked tank, guarding an intersection in the middle of the night in Iraq. My medic noticed a person, arms hugged around him, running towards them. Suicide bombers were prevalent during that time. We had a few mass casualty events where bombers took out dozens of people in crowded marketplaces. My medic fired a warning shot in the air from a distance. The person kept running. He aimed lower and shot him in the chest. My guys couldn't check the body until EOD showed up with their robot an hour later. Meanwhile, the person died, laying in a pool of his own blood as the robot was checking for explosives. There weren't any. Turns out it wasn't him at all. It was the girl with Down syndrome who lived down the block, and had escaped from her parents' home after curfew. My medic didn't let too much emotion show through, but I knew it really hurt him. He was devoted to saving civilian lives, and fate had forced him to watch the slow death of the innocent disabled girl he had shot down. I'm done with war. Keep playing those video games, kids. Once upon a time there was a poor child, with no father and no mother, and everything was dead, and no one was left in the whole world. Everything was dead. And the child went and searched day and night, and since nobody was left on the earth, he wanted to go into the heavens. And the moon was looking at him so friendly, and when finally got to the moon was a piece of rotten wood. And then he went to the sun, and when he got there the sun was a wilted sunflower. And when he got to the stars, they were little golden flies stuck up there like the shrike sticks them on the blackthorn. And when he wanted to go back down to earth, the earth was an overturned passport. And he was all alone. And he sat down and he cried. And he is there to this day. All alone. Okay, there's your story. Night night.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.